Gender, Equality and Difference at the University of Iceland. I want to welcome you to the 6th lecture in the Spring 2023 lecture series on decolonization. Today's lecture is titled Reclaiming the Map, Power and Politics of Colonial Cartography. My name is Anne-Sophie Krømo, and I'm an associate professor of Danish here at the University of Iceland. And I'll be your moderator today, be moderating the session. And today's lecturer, more importantly, is Benjamin Hennig. Benjamin Hennig is a professor of geography at the University of Iceland. Professor Hennig is a geographer interested in social and spatial inequalities, humanity's impact on the earth, global sustainability, and the development of concepts for analyzing, visualizing, and mapping these issues through, for example, the use of geographic information systems, GIS, remote sensing, and cartographic methods. But before I give the floor to our lecturer, I want to mention that after the lecture, which will be approximately 40 minutes, we'll have time for your questions and comments if you have any. And so that if there's something you want to hear more about or want to ask about, you're very welcome to take notes and do so after the lecture. So, without further ado, I want to welcome today's lecturer to the floor. We're looking very much forward to the lecture.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Never start with apologizing, but I have to apologize for my voice. So I hope you can all hear me all right and that my voice stays tuned for the next 40 or so minutes. So I'm going to talk about cartography. And obviously, I need to acknowledge being a middle-aged white man talking about decolonization is probably a little bit problematic because I bring in a Western-centric perspective on an issue that arguably maybe my predecessors have created. Also, I'm not really per se conducting research in colonial cartographies, but maps are basically my field of work, as it was mentioned in the introduction. And mapping has become an integral part of basically what I do as a geographer. So the critical approach to using maps, to utilizing maps, but also a critical approach to actually making maps and integrating them in research is where I'm coming from and defines part of my background as a geographer and my work. In the background here, you see the only image of my own mapping works, whereas during the lecture I'm going to show you a lot more examples of other people's works. If you're curious about this map, you have a chance to ask a question about this after this session, just to give you a little bit of an idea of the kind of mappings that I'm personally involved in doing my research. But let me start off not with a map, but with a photograph. This is a photo of a volcano, quite obviously. It was taken in 2019 as part of while I was on a research leave in New Zealand, and it shows a place that didn't exist the same way as it does now when I first visited this place about 20 years earlier in 2001. Here's another mountain, another photo of a place that now doesn't exist the same way as it did exist when I first saw it in my late childhood, early youth in the early 1990s. So what has happened to these places? Geology obviously is known for being relatively slow and subtle in terms of changing landscapes, even if it's a bit faster in places like Iceland. But why are these places so different within decades of my life? What has happened to these places is a change in identity. The volcano you see in the background in New Zealand is a place that when I first saw it was called Mount Egmont. It's now called Taranaki. The mountain here in Alaska was known as Mount McKinley and is now known as Denali. And what has happened to these places is they changed their identity and started to acknowledge their colonial legacy and their colonial history, and is an indication of the changing human nature of places. And that's down to power and politics. And we'll see or learn a little bit more about this during my lecture, and how geography and cartography are an essential part in these processes. How they make places, how they shape their meaning, how they shape their perception in our minds, and how basically putting places like these on a map is an act of creating reality. And that has a lot to do with colonial legacies and with the way of how we are going to see and understand the world. And cartographically speaking, the 19th and maybe early 20th century were the heyday of the impact of colonial, mostly European colonial powers to acquire maps, to start surveying lands, to basically start mapping out the entire planet and the places that they conquered. I say Europe, that's the United Kingdom, France, Spain, Germany, but also countries like Russia, Japan, and so on had the same tendency on leaving their imprint and footprint on the planet, and to shape the kind of more traditional aspects of colonialism that shape the way of how the world works quite a lot, and that have implications on today's world. And this is all part of a segment in cartography that's called critical cartography. I use a quote here from Wikipedia that sets out what critical cartography means. Obviously, there's a lot of academic works existing as well. But in a nutshell, critical cartography started emerging in the second half of the 20th century, starting to realize and acknowledge the critical role that map-making, cartographic practices have in shaping identities of places, in shaping views and opinions, and to start critically engage with this power and challenge these realities that have been created as a result. And where we think we use maps just as a practical tool on a day-to-day basis, when we take out our phone, they're not as innocent as they sometimes might seem. They structure our experience, they limit our imaginations and possibilities of what we see the reality as, or how we interact in the realities, and quite often they reflect and perpetuate relations of power. So basically, they have been created or are sometimes created serving the interests of dominant groups. So maps make reality as much as they represent the reality. And here's a second quote, that's from an academic work from Pickles. He says that maps are actively constructed knowledge, as the quote says here. They are the product of powerful means of promoting social change, or they can be a powerful means of promoting social change. So maps are not just something that guides our orientation to get from one place to another, but they are quite fundamental in our experience of this world, and critical cartography started kind of dealing with this from a conceptual but also from a practical perspective. Now let's move over to seeing some actual maps. First of all, looking at this map, you need to consider that imagining alternate histories is probably something that is quite dangerous to do. The question of what would have been if something had been different is just a mind game that is not helping us to change the reality. But these what-if questions can sometimes be quite useful in starting to acknowledge and to realize what kind of realities we have actually created. So what we are seeing here on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side you see a segment from the top of this map being enlarged. Now, where's the pointer? There it is. So this upper part here can be seen on the right-hand side. And this is a hypothetical map of the world as seen from a Mayan perspective, and asks the question, what would the world look like had the Mayans colonized the Western world, Europe, and how would they draw the maps of the world if they had been the colonial powers? So it uses some notions of the Mayan world, such as putting east on top of the map. It kind of blurs out the boundaries of the unknown worlds. And it kind of challenges our perception of a world order that we understand and that we live in, that has been created predominantly in the 19th century, as I was saying before. So you can kind of imagine these alternate histories if something different had happened over the course of history. And quite a few of these kinds of mappings do exist that help us to kind of challenge of what we perceive as being the normal, the accepted worldview. A normal accepted worldview is more one that emerges from maps like this. This is a map from the 16th century from a person called Mercator that you've all probably heard about. And it's a quite important map in the history of cartography in that regard, as Mercator was one of the people at the time who worked on the more conceptual side of cartography to find a way of drawing maps that help us to navigate the planet. At that time, mostly helping seafarers to get from one place to the other. What we need to keep in mind, cartographically speaking, that each map that we draw on a flat surface or on a flat computer screen is a compromise. We cannot draw maps that are completely correct. We need to make compromises with regards to size, shapes, distances. This cannot all be maintained in one map the same way, but we have to make compromises between these different entities. What Mercator did here at the time in creating his world, or his map of the world and his projection, was basically a map that preserves right angles. So you have the lines of latitudes and longitudes always crossing at right angles, which at the time when we didn't have GPS devices helped seafarers to actually use the sun, the stars, and so on for navigation, where these lines of constant bearing are a quite crucial element and entity for a map to have. But the result of such a construct of a map, geometric construct of a map, is that the closer you come towards the polar regions, to the South Pole and North Pole, the more exaggerated the area becomes in the map. That's just a mathematical result of the way of how the map is constructed. It's not deliberately done, or hasn't been deliberately done by Mercator to over-represent, for example, the land masses on the northern hemisphere, but it has been done, or it is a compromise that helps to basically use this map as a very helpful navigational tool. It also explains you why, for example, your maps on your computer screens, on your phones quite often, use a derivation of Mercator, so-called web Mercator, in order to calculate your routing, because it's very practical, and it doesn't matter that you have these exaggerations when you zoom into a specific location where these distortions no longer play a role. So when a road makes a right turn, a right angle, it is a right angle in the real world, which some other map projections do not have because of other compromises. But basically the result of this map projection is places like Europe, North America are vastly overrepresented in the map. What it also contains is a European bias. Europe is in the center of the map, and that has been perpetuated later on when, for example, the prime meridian, 0-degree latitude was defined, longitude, sorry, was defined in the conference in the 19th century. So this kind of Eurocentric view was manifested in maps. But you could basically argue that this is a predecessor. This kind of map actually enabled colonialism to actually start and take place, because it allowed people to get on boats to discover new worlds that have been there before and where people lived before. And then it allowed colonialism to become that development in the 19th century that basically made these developments in not only map making, but in basically shaping the political realities of today. And what you need in order to claim territories, you need a map to show that territories are yours. So maps are quite powerful in that instance. Maps are about political control. Maps are about public perception, to show your home country that you own an empire, that you show that you matter and how you matter. And basically that's why maps formed one fundamental part between the 16th and 20th century, so between these early days of these maps and the 20th century, to enable the colonial powers to structure and limit our experiences and knowledge of the landscape. And I was mentioning critical cartography before. It was only after the Second World War that this was being reflected on much more actively in the academic community, in the academic debate. So for example, what you see here is Peter's map of the world. He utilizes a different type of map projection developed by Gall in the 19th century. That is an equal area projection of the world. Most of you will have seen this kind of map as well. It's a different way of drawing the map. You still have right angles, but you have different forms of distortion. You see that Greenland, our neighbor, and even Iceland look a little bit more like flat pancakes on this map because they no longer preserve the original shapes of the countries. But therefore, we have a representation where we can compare the sizes of a country. And Arno Peters was one of those scholars, he's a historian by training, who started challenging our worldview by proposing this as being the more accurate representation of the world because it no longer overrepresents the sort of Western, northern powers. Which American president would want to hang this map into their office compared to a Mercator projection? So it's kind of a challenging perspective. And he made slight adjustments. You can see bits of Russia still being on the right-hand side of the map and not flipped over to the other side because he shifted the center of the map ever so slightly towards the east so that all the land masses are more in place. Still, arguably, you could say it's a Eurocentric view, of course. That wasn't addressed here. And he developed this map projection for reasons of political activism. And that kind of started academic debates in the 70s up into the 90s, which were kind of the predecessor or were necessary in order to start moving towards the territory where we are now in, towards utilizing maps for, let's say, resolving or challenging socio-economic problems, and which led to a discourse about the critical notion of maps. And maps were really not ever simple tools of just getting one place to another. They were often about cutting up the world into different parts, drawing up lines, sometimes random lines in the sand, or even just on paper. Cartographers who were drawing up some of these boundaries that you see emerging here between the 16th and 20th or 21st century, 20th century. Some of the cartographers never saw these places. Some of these lines that we have drawn as national boundaries were just drawn based on, not on geographic realities, not on society realities, but based on colonial perspectives, how to divide up the continent, how to divide up, you see in the top right corner, presumably a newly discovered world. So basically borders became just dashed lines on a piece of paper. And this is what we basically see in today's world, these colonial legacies that drew up the borders of the Americas, that drew up the borders on much of the African continent and so on, where basically mostly European powers started dividing the world and defining how the political realities were, and also how to basically build infrastructure and so on that serves the exploitation of these areas. So mapping plays a crucial part in these developments and trends. And much of our image of the world as we see it today, like this one here, has been shaped basically in very recent human history, mostly in the 19th, early 20th century. And this kind of image did not always or has not always existed like that. Most of the lines that you see here, the red and the blue lines in this map, they only were created in the early 20th century, and they just came into existence sometimes with a stroke of a pen at a conference that decided on things. So these lines dominate, and that basically means the world as how we perceive it today was shaped in a relatively short period of history. But it leaves the lasting legacies, because when borders are drawn up or messed up by colonial powers, then we start getting conflicts all around the world, like this example from of disputed regions in South Asia, for example, shows. We have ongoing conflicts because of these border disputes, and where different territorial claims are being made, and where we have quite complex political developments as a result of that. So maps are still the tension of space, and China, that was shown in the previous map, is a good example for that. What you see in this very recent map here, if you look at the Chinese passport, in this area here, we can see the so-called Spratly Islands marked in a map of China in a Chinese passport. It basically relates to how Western powers have always operated before. An empire is nothing without a territory, so you claim territory for yourself. And what is going on in the South China Sea is a quite good example of that. So previously we saw the cartographic expression of this in a passport, but the Spratly Islands down here are part of a highly disputed area of small, mostly uninhabited islands in the South China Sea that are overall claimed by 6 different nations, and where the actual legal status of these islands is disputed and by far from being accepted or being found as a compromise. And this is not only due to strategic positions, being on one of the important global shipping routes, but of course also, as you can see here on the bottom left, this is also about access to resources. Colonialism in the past has always as much been about political power as it has been about having access to resources and exploitation of natural and other environments. So we see this kind of new forms of colonialism just continuing that have started a few centuries ago, and the occupation of small islands like on the Spratly Islands as an example starts to have an impact on the actual real world geographies. So what is happening, for example, in the South China Sea? If we move towards the Swallow Reef, which is located here, we can see how such environments change as a result of these ongoing conflicts. This is the Swallow Reef, part of the Spratly Islands. This is what it looked like before the 1990s or 1980s. And this is what it looks like today after Malaysia started building an airstrip and uses it as a naval base, partly also for tourism and research purposes. So we are on previously uninhabited islands that suddenly are utilized to make these territorial claims, to redraw the map of these particular regions. And 7 of such airports have been built on the 19 Spratly Islands by now by the different countries in order to lay down their claims on these territories and on the surrounding seafloor. Which brings us to the question, is like, who is drawing these cartographies in the first place? Back in the old days, these were mostly government or power-influenced agencies, like national mapping agencies that were operating, or companies that were operating in the interest of the respective governments. They were defining the borders of the world map, but now we've got digital maps, and we have a fundamental shift in how these cartographies are being drawn out. We might think that digitization has led to some kind of liberation of mapping practices, but to some extent, the opposite is also true. So we have a fundamental shift in who is controlling our cartographic knowledge, but also our cartographic perception. Instead of the big publishing houses, which were serving their respective countries and governments, we now have large global corporations drawing the maps of the world for us. And what you see in this map here is an outline of which countries have some form of border disputes or borders omitted by Google Maps, arguably probably the biggest global corporation serving us with cartographic works nowadays, and which is basically the dominant mapping environment and mapping service of our time that quite a lot of us are relying on. So you see in how many parts of the world actually ongoing conflicts are being actively influenced by global corporations like Google. And let's take a look at what kind of shape this can take at a conflict that is quite relevant these days, and how global corporations deal with this. So let's take a look at Crimea. I don't need to explain much of what has been going on here, annexed by Russia in 2014 from Ukraine following the Ukrainian revolution, which at the time has led to a war of words. This is the Canadian representative at NATO, tweeting this sort of stereotypical map of Ukraine and Russia, including Crimea, in order to make that point about Crimea being part of Ukraine and not Russia. It's not a well-drawn map, it's a very polemic map, arguably, and it shows like how maps, of course, have always also been used as a propaganda instrument to convey some form of political message, which led to a response from the Russians and a war of maps in the same manner by the Russian representatives at NATO. At the time, it's still existent, to publish a much more polished map that looks cartographically sleek and clean and trustworthy, much more than sort of polemic version on the left-hand side, which obviously, in the Russian interest, shows Crimea as being part of Russia and not as part of Crimea. What is interesting in here, you can see, for example, this area here, following the 2008 Russo-Georgian War. We've got this area which Russia acknowledges in this map as being a disputed area because it serves their interest, whereas Crimea is not shown as disputed. But you see like how the actual messaging and the cartographic techniques can actually change the way of how a perception is being made. Clean and polished representation presents realities that you kind of take on board as part of your personal view. And it kind of is at least almost a point win for Russia in this conflict of, or in this conversation on Twitter, which we shouldn't overemphasize the importance, but obviously it's playing against the way of the stereotypical representation that Canada was using in here. But how do global tech giants like Google Maps handle such situations? Back in the old days, traditional map makers like the Times Atlas of the world, they work with a judgment from the map maker to decide on how to draw borders on a map. There are different cartographic techniques, straightforward. You can draw a line to make a definite statement on a border. You can indicate through fuzzy lines or some kind of disputed areas through cartographic means. You can integrate or decide to exclude cartographic depictions of territorial disputes, but once you've done that, and once the map has been printed, then this is the reality that you have created. Now we have Google Maps. About 1 billion users every month. So probably the largest ever publisher of maps so far that we have seen. And what they do is, with this large user base all around the world, they basically just produce different maps for different audiences. What you see here is, in the center of the slide, you see the depiction of Crimea when you look at it through a Ukrainian computer or through the Ukrainian internet as part of Ukraine. On the right-hand side, you see how it's being depicted in Russia as being part of Russia, and on the left-hand side, you see the sort of more disputed character or the problematic character of the territory through a dotted line or dashed line, as we would see it on Google Maps. So apart from different language versions of the maps, Google represents different realities in order to follow national regulations, political pressure, and sort of demands by the local authorities. And they draw different borders to different audiences, but they are the actual corporation who has the power over deciding to do that or to decide to not show this. They also produce different versions of borders on the Spratly Islands and so on, for example. So they just go along with whatever they feel is the most appropriate or whatever pressure is being put on them to be able to operate commercially in a certain political entity. Let's move to other areas of the world that probably weren't as relevant during colonial times as they are now today. So from lines in the sand on the African continent drawn up by cartographers in Europe to divide up the African continent, we are now moving to drawing lines in the ice. With climate change making, for example, resources in the Arctic ever more accessible, we can see between these two maps territorial claims that Russia is having on the Arctic waters and claims from other countries that kind of go against the international treaties of how much of the seabed or how much of the surrounding sea areas belong to your country based on the continental shelf. So between 2001 and 2015, we see changing boundaries in the Arctic with more awareness that there are resources that will soon become available, that there are shipping routes that will soon become accessible. And as I was mentioning before, colonialism has always as much been about political power as it has been about exploitation. Exploitation of people, exploitation of natural resources that is now going all the way to areas that were never of interest before due to inhabitability, so that people can't just live there. And geography, cartography as disciplines have been an integral part of these processes. They help to manifest these claims. They help to draw these realities and to support these territorial claims on new lands. And geography has also been a quite helpful discipline and tool in order to argue for certain claims to be made, for natural, for societal, for historic reasons. So geographers have a lot of questions to answer when it comes to responding to decolonizing the discipline. And throughout the 19th and early 20th century, colonial powers frequently used the rhetoric of empty lands as a justification for their actions. So empty lands, they can be occupied because nobody is there, and it's used as an explanation to legitimize violence, to legitimize genocide all around the world of indigenous inhabitants. One place where this was not the case was Antarctica. When the first colonialists arrived in Antarctica, explorers, as we also call them, there were no humans there, at least. And yet the way of how this continent started being conquered, being explored, follows the same patterns of colonialism that we can see prior to that in the sort of Western colonization, mostly Western colonization of the world. If you look at Antarctica nowadays, these are borders that are making or laying down territorial claims by different nations on the Antarctic continent. This is somewhat against the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, under which this is a continent that's shared by the entirety of humanity and where there should not be any exploitation be taking place. It's there for preservation, for conservation, for research shared by everyone, by all of humanity. But these kind of territorial claims have been manifested the same way as the previous actions by colonialists. If you look at the place names on the right-hand side of the map, or if you look at the place names on a map of Antarctica in general, they pretty much reflect these divisions of, or these claims that territories put on the continents. So you will see Princess Elizabeth Land, you will see Queen Mary Land in the British claimed parts of Antarctica, which, in the case of future conflicts, will surely be used as a source for potential claims to be laid down. A legacy of the early colonization of the continent that basically shows like, look, we've been here before. This was ours. It has our name attached to it. So cartography creates realities. Even if we have treaties that are there to avoid these realities, this will not matter when it comes to the actual exploitation of such places. Coming back and looking at the time, coming back to the beginning, these kind of, or there have been counter efforts in the past few decades that kind of are a follow-up to the critical discourse within cartography that started spilling over into actual novel forms of map-making processes. I mentioned digitization before, and you can argue that the internet has helped to kind of liberate to some degree geographic information and the entity of map making out of the hands of experts, of academics into the hands of everyone. So non-experts will suddenly enabled to draw their own maps, to reclaim the map, to create counter-cartographies compared to the ones that existed before or that were drawn up by powerful institutions, publishing houses, or whoever was involved in the process. Crowdsourcing, open data, social media, these are all trends that kind of helped liberate the field of cartography, the field of map making, and to start standing against these sort of colonial legacies, to start standing against political and commercial powers and stakeholders. And what we can see that counter mapping originally was first addressed against very specifically these colonial legacies and against this impact on indigenous populations. And we started seeing the first successes, actual real-world successes of these counter mapping efforts. For example, on the left-hand side, you see here Mount Taranaki, Mount Egmont that I was showing in the beginning, having changed its name, not only through counter-cartographies, but acknowledged by the national mapping agencies, who by now get around 600 requests for name changes all around New Zealand for consideration to change names back to their indigenous meaning, or to use two names. So they have the power to decide on this. This becomes part of the actual national entities of the national mapping agencies. So it's no longer just activists working on this, but governments and government institutions being pushed into changing their approaches. You will have heard New Zealand being referred to as Aotearoa now again, to acknowledge the Maori heritage and these kind of efforts. And the same is true in Alaska. It was Obama who decided to rename Mount McKinley into Denali to acknowledge the indigenous origins. So these kind of counter-mapping efforts have started changing and have started decolonizing the map. And this is, of course, never without controversy. If you rename a place, you change its cultural, its historic identity. Just erasing colonial heritage is also erasing part of the history itself. You can, of course, argue we need decolonization first, but of course we also need to keep in mind that we do not eradicate some part of the history and forget about this part of the history, which is just as important to acknowledge. And generally, when you rename a place, you change a place's identity. And that is sometimes deliberate, but it can sometimes also result in just accidental changes on how people perceive places. So you replace history, one part through another. And you see these kind of efforts all around the world. You see in Canada, a new province, Nunavut, has been created in the Northwest Territories to give indigenous people more power and control over certain parts of the land. They're probably arguably not the most valuable ones for Canadians. You see in India renaming of cities, Bombay to Mumbai, Calcutta to Calcutta to Calcutta, and so on. So you see all around the world an acknowledgement that these are important issues to address and to consider when you look at identities of places. And counter-cartographies were the beginning of these processes, and it's all part of this debate about colonial legacies. Let me end on some examples, or one example from the History of Cartography project, which was started by this critical cartography movement in the 1980s, which is ongoing. They have a huge collection, amongst other things, of indigenous pre-scientific or undiscipline-related mappings, such as these ones you see here, indigenous mappings from Greenland that show us carvings of particular coastlines in Greenland that indigenous people used to navigate via the seas. And the point I'm trying to make here is that it's important to start considering this pre-colonial knowledge and identity of places in order to better understand the places and the role that colonization played into transforming places, transforming societies, transforming the people who live there. And just to kind of mirror the mind game I started off with in the beginning, this is a map of Denmark. I appreciate that it's probably very difficult to read from you in the audience right now. but try to look it up again. It's a similar mind game of what we saw in the beginning from the Mayans, where Denmark is depicted as a colony of Greenland. So whereas Greenland has a lot of Danish royal names on its glaciers and on its all around the island, this is showing Denmark using indigenous Greenlandic names attached and displayed in the way of how Greenland is being visualized in our minds and our perception. So what if Greenland had colonized Denmark? And this map was produced as a sort of counter-mapping effort during a time when Greenland became engaged in the Afghanistan war, to basically just remind the Danish population about the responsibilities they've had for starting or being involved with wars before. So people left off the map is a phenomenon that has prevailed throughout of history. So in Kenya, we can see, for example, Google Maps in the past not displaying informal settlements in much detail. And then initiatives like OpenStreetMap started giving the power into the local population's hands and help them to map out their environments, their informal settlements, and display them as vibrant neighborhoods. So the internet digitization arguably helped to give power to people who were powerless before, to put them literally on the map. And it didn't take long for Google to at least, you see a vibrant neighborhood being depicted on OpenStreetMap, and then at least to some degree, Google Maps started acknowledging that actually there is more happening in these places than just this being empty space, that even local authorities were just depicting as forest in their map, because they were informal settlements. But then, of course, when Google gets involved, you always also have this critical problem of having a powerful institution, agency, actor, stakeholder being involved in the map-making process. So Google being involved in the mapping of such communities can be much more problematic than helping the communities to be involved and engaged in this process themselves. And platforms like OpenStreetMap have helped to liberate, to some degree, this process, though we need to keep in mind that the digital divide is problematic here. Access to technology, access to knowledge of how to do this is still a barrier, but we've got different means nowadays than we had only like 2-3 decades ago to change the maps, to decolonize our knowledge of maps. OpenStreetMap in itself is not an actual map. OpenStreetMap is just the digital database of geographic information. But everybody can contribute to this digital database, and everybody can use this database to draw their own maps. It contains different language versions of place names. It contains all sorts of information that commercial providers like Google Maps, Apple Maps, and so on are not counting, are not surveying, because they are not in any commercial interest. And you can choose what you display, whereas Google chooses for you what to display to you based on commercial interest, based on someone who's paying you to see a certain cafe or to see a certain commercial interest. So there has been some form of empowerment and opening of the mapping process to all stakeholders, for better or worse. Everybody can be involved in this, but it's part of at least giving or providing platforms to empower the disadvantaged. It also empowers, of course, the powerful at the same time. They can also utilize this. And to end this very short overview of decolonizing cartography, we should see cartography not always just only from the end result, a final piece of a map, of a visualization, but we should also see cartography as a process. And the process being a quite important part of knowledge production, part of discovery, a part of transformation. So when we are drawing maps together with communities, we are starting to acknowledge, to incorporate knowledge from individuals, from communities, from disadvantaged. And that process in itself can be valuable for both sides, to acknowledge what are your interests, what are your expectations. And it democratizes the process of knowledge production. And since we usually trust maps as something of a representation of realities, we need to engage much more with the process of designing and creating these maps. So this is a form of reclaiming the map that goes far beyond just the very limited scope of colonialism. But we need to keep in mind, when we look at maps, we need to become very critical that they are inherently shaped by the colonial legacies of the ones who started making maps, of the ones who started defining mapping practices. A lot of the cartographic techniques that we use nowadays have been made during the era of colonization. These are all techniques that were developed for conquering new lands. Cartographic practices, cartographic conventions, they have all been invented in these times, so they have this inherent colonial legacy attached to them. But we should see this as an opportunity, because in the end, being aware of this, being critical with this, changing or challenging our perception of the world makes us much more open to understanding the world from different perspectives. And we could, of course, spend a whole lecture series on all of these examples. I just want to point you to some projects like Radical Cartographers. This is not an atlas, they are books, but they are also websites, as well as the Decolonial Atlas, which have a multitude of examples, of which I could only show you a few here, who bridge the disciplines of art and science, cartography and activism, and create counter-cartographies. And let me end on a final map and on a final thought. Maps are maybe strategic weapons that can express power, but maps can be used to make counterclaims, and they can change. They can trigger change and induce change, like the examples from New Zealand and Alaska shows you. And thinking about maps in a more critical way, not only inherently through the lens of colonialism, but much more critically in general, what kind of information we are being represented is the first step to challenge our Western-centric worldview, and maybe helps us to rediscover knowledge about places, indigenous knowledge, for example, about places, that also helps us in turn to live in more harmony with the natural environment, that overcomes this colonial attitude of exploitation of places, of power relations, where indigenous knowledge is so much older than the knowledge that colonialists only brought in with their commercial and power interests. And this map here kind of shows how short-sighted our perspective on the planet is. It's a map of Pangaea, so what the world looked like about 300 million years ago, but drawn on top of it are today's, or more or less today's, borders, which of course don't make any sense in a geographic relation when you see it through the perspective of Pangaea. Borders drawn then would have probably looked completely different, but it shows us how quickly this world is changing and how short-sighted our transformation of the world in only 200, 300, 400 years is, and how little it matters to the actual shaping of the planet. So we are creating artificial realities that have very little to do with the actual physical reality of the world, and trying to remind us of this legacy and identity probably helps us to decolonize the maps, decolonize and us ourselves from the constraints with which we are looking at this planet. So sorry for overrunning by about 10 minutes, but I hope it gave you a little bit of an overview of what colonial cartography entails, and maybe makes you hungry for learning more and diving into some of these examples that I've shown you before. Thank you.